Imagine walking into a place you helped build, a place you poured your heart into, only to be treated like you don't even exist. That's what happened to Olivia Turner when she stepped into Café Renaissance, a place she thought was a sanctuary for everyone, regardless of who they were. What she didn't expect was to be ignored, humiliated, and disrespected by her own employee. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and life-changing moments, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Olivia Turner stepped into Café Renaissance that morning with her usual grace. The sophisticated air of the restaurant, with its soft lighting and smooth jazz tunes filling the space, always made her feel welcomed. The velvet curtains hanging from the large windows let in beams of sunlight, giving the room a warm glow. It was a place where she and her husband, Daniel, had invested time and love. Every detail, from the leather chairs to the fresh flower arrangements on each table, was a deliberate choice. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, evoking a sense of comfort and familiarity. As usual, Olivia chose a table by the window. She loved watching the flow of the city outside while enjoying the calm inside the restaurant. Customers came and went, their faces glowing with satisfaction as they experienced the excellent service Café Renaissance was known for. Olivia felt proud. This place was, without a doubt, a reflection of the hard work and dedication she and Daniel had poured into it. But today, something felt off. Jake, the waiter responsible for her area, didn't even glance her way when she sat down. He rushed past her several times, always too busy, always attentive to the other customers. To Olivia, however, there was only silence. The minutes began to drag, and Olivia's discomfort grew. It was strange, she thought. Jake had always been polite and professional. What had changed? She looked around, noticing how the other patrons were being served with smiles and courtesy, while she remained ignored. Jake moved swiftly, attending to one table, then another, but Olivia seemed invisible to him. Maybe he's just busy, she reasoned, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. But after 15 minutes without even a glass of water, Olivia began to suspect there was more to his behavior. With her patience wearing thin, Olivia tried to catch Jake's attention discreetly. She raised her hand, giving a subtle wave, but once again, he ignored her. What should have been a peaceful morning at Café Renaissance was quickly becoming a source of frustration. Olivia, always known for her calm demeanor in challenging situations, now felt a mixture of emotion and indignation bubbling up inside her. She looked around again, but the stark contrast between the service the other customers received and the indifference she faced was glaring. "Am I overreacting?" she thought, trying to maintain her composure. However, as the minutes turned into nearly half an hour, Olivia began to sense that something deeper was at play. This wasn't just bad service, it felt personal. "Jake is ignoring me on purpose," she concluded. The realization caused her stomach to churn. Over the years, she and Daniel had worked tirelessly to create an atmosphere of respect and inclusion at Café Renaissance, and seeing that compromised so blatantly hurt deeply. Every time Jake walked by without acknowledging her, the knot in her throat tightened. The emotion of being treated so indifferently in a place she had helped build began to weigh heavily on her. Olivia knew she couldn't ignore the situation any longer. It was a moment that required courage, something she had always had in abundance, especially in the face of adversity. She stood up firmly, took a deep breath, and decided to confront Jake. She couldn't allow this kind of behavior to go unnoticed, especially in her own restaurant. "Jake, can I speak with you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. The waiter turned reluctantly, clearly surprised by her approach. His cold eyes and expressionless face made it clear he didn't care about what she had to say. "You've been ignoring me since I walked in," Olivia stated directly, without hesitation. Jake, without skipping a beat, responded, I'm not ignoring you. You're overreacting." Those words hit Olivia like a slap in the face. The audacity and contempt in his tone were undeniable. She felt her heart race, her breathing quicken. Everything she had been trying to hold back until that moment came rushing forward. "Is that what you think? That I'm overreacting?" Olivia said, struggling to remain composed. "You're treating me this way because I'm a black woman. Do you think I haven't noticed?" The shock on Jake's face was evident, but he said nothing. The silence between them was deafening. Olivia knew then that this situation went beyond a simple misunderstanding. The prejudice she had faced throughout her life, whether subtle or explicit, was present in this moment. And now here, in Café Renaissance, a place she and Daniel had worked so hard to make a refuge of inclusion, she was feeling the sting of discrimination. Every time Jake avoided eye contact, he only confirmed what she already knew. But Olivia was not someone who backed down from adversity. As she gathered herself to continue, something unexpected happened. Daniel entered the restaurant. His presence always brought a sense of calm and security to Olivia, but in that moment, she knew things were about to change. Daniel had been watching from a distance as the interaction between Olivia and Jake unfolded, and as he approached, he could feel the tension in the air. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but full of authority. Jake, realizing who he was speaking to, suddenly seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. His demeanor changed instantly, as if he could undo his actions with a simple smile. But it was too late. Daniel, always perceptive, had already grasped what was happening. He looked at Jake, and with a firmness that left no room for doubt, said, "You're fired." Jake tried to stammer out an excuse, but Daniel cut him off. "There is no place for discrimination of any kind here at Café Renaissance. What you've done is unacceptable. Gather your things and leave." Daniel's words echoed through the restaurant, making it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated. Olivia, standing by his side, felt a mix of relief and sadness. Though Jake was leaving, the impact of his actions still lingered. As Jake left the restaurant, Olivia and Daniel sat at a table, the silence between them now more reflective than uncomfortable. "I never thought this would happen here," Olivia said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. Daniel took her hand, offering the silent support she had always appreciated. "Unfortunately, racism is everywhere, even in places where we least expect it," he replied. "But we will keep fighting. We won't let this change what we've built here." Olivia nodded, knowing that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but with an unshakable faith that together they could overcome anything. The moment Olivia entered Café Renaissance, she sensed something off, but it wasn't until Jake's behavior became impossible to ignore that her suspicions were confirmed. While other patrons were greeted with warm smiles and efficient service, Olivia received cold indifference. She observed Jake from her table as he moved with ease between the customers, refilling coffee cups, chatting politely, and ensuring everyone had what they needed, everyone except for her. Olivia had seen him work before and knew he could be attentive, yet now he acted as if she were invisible. This blatant disregard began to stir emotions she hadn't expected to feel in a place she considered a second home. As time passed, Olivia's initial patience turned into confusion. She tried to rationalize Jake's behavior. Maybe he's having a bad day, she thought, giving him the benefit of the doubt. But as she watched him go out of his way to be courteous to everyone else, the realization hit her. This wasn't just neglect, this was intentional. Her thoughts began to race. Why was he treating her this way? Was it because she was the owner's wife? Or was there something deeper, more personal behind it? Her heart began to sink as she recalled past instances where she had faced similar treatment, times when people had subtly, or sometimes overtly, shown prejudice against her for reasons she couldn't control. With each passing moment, The rudeness became harder to ignore. Jake continued to treat Olivia as if she wasn't even there. He walked past her table several times, barely glancing in her direction. Even when she tried to catch his eye or wave discreetly, he would deliberately look away, focusing on the next customer with exaggerated politeness. Olivia had been in leadership roles for years, accustomed to managing difficult situations with grace and composure. But this was different. It wasn't just the poor service, it was the utter disrespect, something that cut deeper because it felt so personal. Other customers began to notice the imbalance in the way Jake was treating Olivia. Some shot her sympathetic glances, clearly uncomfortable with what was happening, while others whispered among themselves. The restaurant, usually a haven of warmth and inclusivity, now felt cold. The same elegant surroundings that used to bring Olivia pride now seemed to mock her, as if the very walls were complicit in Jake's silent hostility. She could feel a knot forming in her stomach, the familiar sense of being ostracized creeping in, a feeling she thought she had long left behind. But here it was again, resurfacing in a place that was supposed to represent everything opposite of that. At one point, a couple seated nearby called Jake over to compliment him on his service, and he smiled broadly, engaging them in friendly banter. Olivia overheard part of the conversation, and the disconnect between how he treated them and how he ignored her felt like a slap in the face. Is this really happening? She thought, trying to make sense of the situation. Olivia was no stranger to challenges, but this was different. It was personal, deliberate, and humiliating. Despite the emotion rising in her, she reminded herself to stay composed. But as she sat there, still waiting for any acknowledgement from Jake, her patience was wearing thin. Olivia's inner turmoil grew as Jake continued to serve other tables while blatantly ignoring her. She didn't want to cause a scene, especially not in her own restaurant, but the disrespect was becoming unbearable. Every time Jake walked by her without stopping, without so much as offering a glass of water, it was as if he were sending a clear message: "You don't matter here." Olivia couldn't help but feel a deep sense of frustration. She had worked hard alongside Daniel to build Café Renaissance into a place where everyone was treated with respect, no matter who they were. Yet here she was, being treated as if she were less than the other customers. After nearly 20 minutes of this cold treatment, Olivia decided she couldn't remain silent any longer. As a leader, she knew when to step in, and this was one of those moments. "Jake," she called, her voice calm but firm as he walked by yet again without stopping. He paused briefly, as if considering whether to respond, before finally turning to face her. The look on his face was one of barely concealed annoyance, as if she were an inconvenience in his otherwise perfect day. "Yes?" he asked, his tone flat and indifferent. Olivia's heart sank further. The way he spoke to her, so dismissive, so disrespectful, only confirmed her growing suspicions. "I've been waiting for a while now," Olivia said, choosing her words carefully, trying not to let her frustration show too much. "Can you bring me some water at least?" Jake's response was as cold as his demeanor. "I'll get to it," he said curtly, before turning on his heel and walking away without another word. Olivia watched him go, disbelief washing over her. She had been in this business long enough to know the difference between a busy waiter and one who was being rude on purpose. And this, without a doubt, was deliberate. It was a moment that tested her composure, her perseverance, and her belief in the fairness they had worked so hard to establish at Café Renaissance. As she sat there, waiting, the emotions swirling inside her became more difficult to control. She thought about the countless times she had stood up for others, whether in the workplace or in her personal life, when they were treated unfairly. Now, it was her turn to face this kind of treatment head-on. The fact that it was happening in a place she helped create made it all the more painful. Olivia knew she had to do something. She couldn't let this slide, not here, not in front of all these people who were watching, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. The time had come for her to stand up for herself. It wasn't just about a glass of water anymore. It was about something much bigger: dignity, respect, and the principles she and Daniel had built their lives around. She had always believed in facing adversity with grace, but sometimes grace required confrontation. Olivia could feel the tension building within her as she prepared to speak out. The moment of truth was approaching, and she knew that once she spoke, there would be no turning back. Yet, deep down, she also knew this was necessary. She couldn't allow someone like Jake to undermine everything they had worked so hard to create. The minutes ticked by, and Olivia's patience, once firm and steady, was beginning to fray. She glanced at her watch. 20 minutes had passed since she sat down, and still, not even a simple glass of water had been placed on her table. Around her, the restaurant bustled with activity, customers laughing and chatting as they were attentively served by the waitstaff. But for Olivia, it was as if she didn't exist. Each passing second felt heavier than the last, her frustration growing as Jake continued to breeze past her without so much as a glance in her direction. The warmth and sophistication of Café Renaissance, once a source of pride, now felt like a backdrop to her mounting irritation. Olivia couldn't understand how Jake could justify ignoring her for so long. She had seen him serve countless customers in the time she had been waiting, refilling drinks, taking orders, clearing tables. His service to others was impeccable, but his attitude toward her was dismissive at best, outright rude at worst. She shifted in her seat, trying to calm herself, but the longer she sat there without being acknowledged, the more difficult it became to maintain her composure. The emotional toll of being ignored in a space she helped build was starting to weigh on her. She had always been someone who faced challenges with resilience, but this silent treatment felt deeply personal. At one point, Olivia considered leaving the restaurant altogether. The thought of simply walking out crossed her mind more than once. But no, that wasn't who she was. Olivia Turner did not run away from problems. She confronted them. And this wasn't just about bad service anymore. It was about respect. She had given years of her life to this place, pouring her heart into making it a sanctuary for others. The fact that she was being treated so dismissively was a betrayal of everything she and Daniel had worked for. Still, the question gnawed at her: why was Jake behaving this way? The discomfort of being ignored began to mix with a deeper, more painful realization. Olivia had faced subtle forms of discrimination throughout her life. Looks, words, attitudes that suggested she didn't belong. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that Café Renaissance was different. It was supposed to be a place where everyone was treated with kindness and respect, regardless of who they were. Yet here she was, being made to feel like an outsider in her own establishment. The longer Jake ignored her, the more her mind wandered down painful roads, considering all the possible reasons for his behavior. And the more she thought about it, the clearer it became: this wasn't just bad service. It was something far more insidious. As the 30-minute mark approached, Olivia's frustration reached its peak. Her mouth was dry, her body tense, and the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. She had asked for nothing complicated, just a glass of water, a simple acknowledgement. Yet, Jake seemed determined to pretend she didn't exist. The emotional strain of waiting, of being treated as if she were invisible, was overwhelming. She could feel the tension rising in her chest, her thoughts racing faster with every passing moment. Why was this happening? What had she done to deserve this level of disrespect? Olivia's mind was a whirlwind of questions, none of which had clear answers. Finally, she decided to try one last time. Olivia raised her hand again, hoping Jake would finally acknowledge her. He walked by, glancing briefly in her direction, but once again, he ignored her. The frustration she had been trying to keep in check was now at the surface, impossible to hide. She sat back in her chair, defeated for a moment, wondering how much longer she could sit there before she said something. Her emotions were teetering between hurt and anger, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the calm, composed exterior she had worked so hard to preserve. She had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, but Jake's behavior had pushed her to the brink. The tables around her were a stark contrast to her own situation. Customers were laughing, clinking glasses, enjoying their meals and the attentive service they received. It was as if Olivia was in a parallel universe, one where she didn't matter, where her presence was insignificant. She watched as Jake continued to glide between tables, his demeanor cheerful and professional with every other customer. Her frustration mixed with disbelief. How could he act like this toward her? She wasn't just a regular customer. She was part of the reason this place existed. And yet, here she was, waiting, still unnoticed, still disrespected. The weight of the situation began to take its toll on Olivia emotionally. She had come to the restaurant that morning with the intention of enjoying a peaceful moment, maybe catching up on work or simply relaxing. But instead, she found herself caught in an uncomfortable and deeply hurtful experience. The frustration of waiting was not just about the service. It was about the message Jake was sending with his actions. "I don't see you. You don't matter." These were the unspoken words that echoed in Olivia's mind every time Jake walked by without acknowledging her. It was more than just a service failure. It was an emotional slight. The final straw came when Olivia saw Jake bring a pitcher of water to the table next to hers. She watched as he filled the glasses of the couple seated there, smiling as he did so. Her patience snapped. How much longer was she expected to wait? How much longer would he ignore her while treating everyone else with the respect and courtesy they deserved? The frustration and hurt that had been simmering inside her now boiled over. She knew it was time to act. Olivia straightened in her seat, her heart pounding in her chest, and prepared herself for the confrontation she could no longer avoid. Olivia had always prided herself on her patience, but after almost an hour of being ignored, she could no longer hold back. The frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface finally reached a boiling point. She rose from her seat, her heart pounding as she made her way over to Jake, who was, once again, busy serving another table. "Jake," she called, her voice steady but firm. It wasn't a shout, but there was no mistaking the authority in her tone. Jake glanced over his shoulder, a look of annoyance crossing his face before he reluctantly turned to face her. For a moment, the bustling restaurant seemed to fall silent, all eyes now on the confrontation unfolding. "Why have you been ignoring me?" Olivia asked, her voice calm but edged with the emotion she had been holding back for so long. She didn't want to make a scene, but the pain and frustration were evident in her words. Jake's response was immediate, almost dismissive. "I haven't been ignoring you," he said, his tone flat and defensive. "You're overreacting." Those words hit Olivia harder than she expected. Overreacting. After nearly an hour of being treated like she didn't exist, those were the words he chose? The disbelief on her face was clear. It wasn't just his actions that stung, it was his refusal to acknowledge the harm he had caused. Olivia took a breath, steadying herself. She had always been taught to approach situations with grace, but in that moment, it was difficult to keep her emotions in check. "I've been sitting at that table for almost an hour, and you haven't even offered me a glass of water," she said, her voice still controlled but laced with the frustration she had been trying to suppress. Jake shrugged, clearly uninterested in her complaint. "I've been busy," he replied curtly, as if that explanation could justify his actions. But Olivia wasn't going to let it slide. This wasn't just about a missed order or poor service. It was about respect, something she felt had been denied to her from the moment she walked in. As Olivia stood there, facing Jake, a thought crossed her mind that she couldn't ignore any longer. It wasn't just the rudeness or the bad service. "You're treating me like this because I'm a black woman, aren't you?" Olivia said, her voice unwavering, the weight of the accusation hanging in the air between them. The words, once spoken, seemed to freeze the space around them. Jake's eyes widened for a split second, a flash of surprise that quickly turned into indignation. "That's not true," he spat, his face reddening. But Olivia had seen enough in her life to know when she was being discriminated against, and this was one of those times. She knew the look, the tone, the subtle but undeniable signs. The restaurant fell into an awkward hush as other customers pretended not to eavesdrop on the escalating situation. Some glanced nervously over their shoulders, others whispered to each other, but Olivia was focused solely on Jake. "You think I didn't notice how you've been serving everyone else, but not me," she continued, her voice rising just enough to make sure he couldn't ignore her any longer. "You think I don't know what's happening here?" Jake's face hardened, his defenses going up. "I treat everyone the same," he muttered, but even as he said it, the falseness of his words hung heavy in the air. Olivia could feel her pulse racing, her hands trembling slightly as she fought to maintain her composure. She had faced discrimination before, but never so blatantly, and never in a place she had helped to build. It felt like a betrayal, and the weight of that betrayal pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. "This isn't about the water, Jake," Olivia said, her voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "This is about respect. And you've shown me none." Jake shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that this confrontation wasn't going the way he had anticipated. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this was more than just a customer complaint. It was a deeper issue, one that he couldn't brush aside. But instead of apologizing, Jake doubled down. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said, his voice rising slightly in frustration. "I've been busy, and you're taking it personally." Olivia's eyes narrowed. This was no longer just a matter of poor service, it was about dignity. And Jake, through his dismissive words and actions, had stripped her of that in front of everyone. The anger that had been bubbling beneath the surface was now impossible to contain. "I'm taking it personally because it is personal," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside her. "You've treated me like I don't matter, and that's not something I'm going to tolerate." At that moment, Olivia felt something shift inside her. She had always been someone who faced challenges head-on, but this felt different. This wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about standing up for something bigger, for the countless times she had been made to feel less than, for the moments when her worth had been questioned simply because of the color of her skin. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without making it clear that she deserved the same respect and dignity as anyone else in that restaurant. "You can't treat people like this, Jake," Olivia said, her voice full of the strength she had drawn on so many times before. "Not here. Not anywhere." Just as Olivia was preparing to respond to Jake's defiance, the door of Café Renaissance swung open, and in walked Daniel Turner, her husband and the co-owner of the restaurant. His tall frame and calm demeanor commanded respect as soon as he entered any room, and today was no exception. He had just returned from a business meeting, unaware of the tension building within the walls of his own restaurant. The moment he stepped inside, however, Daniel could feel that something was off. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Olivia, standing face to face with Jake, their exchange clearly heated. He knew his wife well enough to sense that something serious was unfolding. As Daniel made his way toward them, Jake's face paled. It was as if, in that instant, he finally understood who Olivia truly was. His posture shifted from arrogance to uncertainty, and the bravado he had displayed moments earlier began to crumble. Up until now, Jake had treated Olivia like any other customer, or rather, like someone who didn't matter. But now, seeing Daniel, the owner of Café Renaissance, approach, the reality of the situation dawned on him. Olivia wasn't just another patron. She wasn't just a woman sitting alone at a table. She was the wife of the man who owned the very restaurant he worked in, and she held a position of power far greater than he had imagined. Daniel approached the two with a calm, yet purposeful stride. His presence alone seemed to silence the restaurant, the usual buzz of conversation falling away as everyone watched, curious to see how this confrontation would play out. Olivia turned to face her husband, relief and frustration mixing in her expression. She didn't need to explain much. Daniel could read the situation clearly just by the tension in the air and the look on Jake's face. "What's going on here?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but firm, his eyes shifting between Olivia and Jake. There was no anger in his tone, just the steady authority of someone who knew when to step in. Jake, visibly nervous now, struggled to regain his composure. There was a misunderstanding," he stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating as Daniel's gaze fixed on him. "I didn't realize who she was." Jake's voice trailed off as he realized how flimsy that excuse sounded. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, his expression remaining unreadable, but Olivia could see the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. She knew that Daniel valued respect and equality above all in their business. The idea that one of their employees could treat her, or anyone, with such disdain was not something he would tolerate. Olivia, her emotions still raw from the confrontation, remained silent for a moment, letting Daniel take the lead. She had already said what needed to be said. Now, it was up to him to handle the situation. Daniel turned to Jake, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. "Misunderstanding," he repeated, his tone measured. "My wife has been sitting here for almost an hour, Jake. She hasn't been served, and she's been treated with disrespect." There was no need for Daniel to raise his voice. His words were enough to cut through the tension like a knife. Jake opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it, realizing there was little he could say to defend himself. Daniel's eyes softened slightly as he glanced at Olivia, silently acknowledging the frustration she must have felt. He could see the hurt in her expression, the way her normally composed demeanor had been shaken by the events of the past hour. "Olivia deserves the same respect as any other customer in this restaurant," Daniel continued, turning his gaze back to Jake. "In fact, she deserves more. She helped build this place." The weight of Daniel's words hung in the air, and Jake seemed to shrink under the intensity of the moment. His earlier arrogance was now replaced with visible regret, but it was clear that whatever apology he might offer would come too late. Jake's demeanor shifted from defensive to apologetic in the span of a heartbeat. "I didn't realize," he began, but Daniel cut him off. "That she was my wife." Daniel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "That shouldn't matter, Jake. It shouldn't matter who she is or what her title is. Every person who walks into this restaurant deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." The room was silent, the tension thick in the air. Daniel's words were a direct reflection of the values he and Olivia had worked so hard to instill in their business, and hearing them spoken aloud in this moment was a powerful reminder of why they had started Café Renaissance in the first place. Jake, now fully aware of the gravity of his actions, shifted awkwardly on his feet. "I'm sorry, Mr. Turner. I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But Daniel wasn't finished. "This isn't about me, Jake," he said, his voice softening but remaining firm. "It's about how you've treated Olivia, and by extension, how you've treated our values." Daniel paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. He wasn't the type to make rash decisions, but in this case, the choice was clear. The damage had been done, and there was no room for someone like Jake in the environment they had cultivated at Café Renaissance. As Jake stood there, the realization that his job was on the line finally hit him. "Please, give me another chance," he pleaded, his earlier bravado completely gone. But Daniel shook his head, his decision already made. "We can't have someone on our team who doesn't share the values we've built this place on," he said quietly. "This isn't just about this one incident. It's about trust, and that's something you've broken." Olivia stood by Daniel's side, watching as her husband handled the situation with the same grace and fairness she had always admired in him. Jake looked down, defeated, as Daniel gave the final word. "You're dismissed, Jake. Please leave." Jake stood there, frozen, as Daniel's words sank in. "You're dismissed, Jake. Please leave." It was a sentence that carried the weight of finality, and there was no room for negotiation. The gravity of his actions had finally caught up to him, and Jake's face went pale as he realized that there was no turning back. The once confident and dismissive attitude he had displayed toward Olivia was now replaced with visible regret. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to offer one last plea, but the words wouldn't come. He knew that he had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed with an apology or a half-hearted excuse. As Jake stood there, struggling to process what had just happened, Daniel remained calm and composed. There was no need for anger or shouting. The decision had been made, and it was clear. "Racism, in any form, will never be tolerated here," Daniel said, his voice steady but firm. "This restaurant was built on the principles of respect and equality, and what you've done today goes against everything we stand for." The message was unmistakable. Jake had not only disrespected Olivia as a customer, but had also violated the very core values of Café Renaissance, a place that Daniel and Olivia had worked tirelessly to create as a safe and inclusive environment for everyone. The weight of Daniel's words was palpable. Jake, clearly shaken, muttered a soft, "I'm sorry, but it was too late." Apologies couldn't undo the harm that had been done. The damage was not just in the way he had treated Olivia, but in the message his actions sent to everyone in the restaurant. The staff had seen it. The customers had seen it. And now, everyone knew that the owners of Café Renaissance would not tolerate discrimination of any kind. The silence in the room was deafening as Jake slowly turned and began to walk toward the back of the restaurant, where he would gather his things and leave. Olivia watched as Jake made his way out, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. She had hoped for an apology, for some sign of remorse earlier, but it had come too late. The dismissal felt like the only appropriate resolution to the situation. It wasn't just about punishing Jake for his behavior. It was about sending a clear message that the values she and Daniel upheld were non-negotiable. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked softly, turning to Olivia as Jake disappeared from sight. His voice was calm, but there was a deep concern in his eyes. Olivia nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her now that the ordeal was finally over. There was no satisfaction in seeing Jake leave. For Olivia, this wasn't a moment of triumph but of disappointment. She had always believed in second chances, in giving people the opportunity to learn from their mistakes, but Jake's actions had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Racism, even in its subtler forms, was something that Olivia and Daniel had fought against their entire lives, and now, in the heart of their own business, they had been forced to confront it head-on. As she took a deep breath, Olivia realized that this was a moment that would stick with her for a long time. The rest of the restaurant seemed to return to normal, slowly but surely. The conversations that had paused during the confrontation picked back up, though the atmosphere was undeniably different. People had witnessed something important, something that reminded them of the values that Café Renaissance stood for. Olivia could sense that the staff and customers alike were processing what had just happened. The dismissal of Jake wasn't just about firing an employee. It was a statement about the kind of place they wanted to run. It was about making sure that everyone who walked through the doors of Café Renaissance knew they would be treated with dignity and respect. As Daniel stood beside Olivia, the tension in the air began to dissipate. He knew that what had just transpired wasn't easy for his wife, but he also knew that they had done the right thing. Firing someone was never pleasant, But this situation called for decisive action. It had to be done, Daniel said quietly, as if reading Olivia's thoughts. She nodded again, her gaze lingering on the door through which Jake had left. "I know," she replied. "It's just hard." There was a long pause as the weight of the morning's events settled over them. They both understood the importance of what had just happened, but it didn't make the situation any less difficult. For Daniel and Olivia, this wasn't just about running a business. It was about creating a space that aligned with their values and the values of the community they served. "We built this place to be different," Daniel said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "And we're going to keep it that way." Olivia smiled faintly, appreciating his unwavering support. Together, they had created something special at Café Renaissance, and despite the challenges they faced, they knew they would continue to stand by the principles that guided them from the start. Jake's dismissal was a necessary step in ensuring that their vision for the restaurant remained intact. As they stood there, side by side, Olivia and Daniel knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be more challenges, more difficult conversations, and more moments where they would need to defend the values they held dear. But today, they had taken a stand. They had shown that Café Renaissance was more than just a restaurant. It was a place where respect, equality, and compassion were not just words but actions. And in that moment, they reaffirmed their commitment to fostering an environment where everyone, no matter who they were, would feel welcomed and valued. After the dust had settled, Olivia and Daniel found themselves sitting at one of the tables near the window, the same one where Olivia had waited earlier. The restaurant had returned to its usual hum of activity, but the energy had shifted. For them, it wasn't just another day, it was a moment that demanded reflection. As the gentle afternoon light poured in, casting a warm glow over the cafe, Olivia looked out onto the street, her thoughts distant. The events of the morning weighed heavily on her, not just because of what had happened, but because of what it symbolized. "I never thought this would happen here," she said softly, her voice tinged with both sadness and disbelief. Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful as he considered her words. "Neither did I," he admitted. "We've worked so hard to make this place feel like a refuge, a space where everyone is treated equally. And yet, even here..." His voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken truth hanging between them. It was painful to acknowledge that even in a place they had carefully cultivated to be welcoming and inclusive, prejudice had found a way in. Café Renaissance had always been more than just a business to them. It was a reflection of their values, their belief in equality, respect, and compassion. And yet, today's events had shown them that the battle against racism was far from over. Olivia sighed, her mind still replaying the moment when she had confronted Jake. "I don't understand how someone can think that way," she said, her frustration bubbling to the surface again. "How can someone work here, in a place that's supposed to be about bringing people together, and still carry those kinds of prejudices?" Daniel reached across the table, gently placing his hand on hers. "It's everywhere, Olivia," he said quietly. "Even in places like this, places we think are safe. Racism doesn't always show up in big, obvious ways. Sometimes it's subtle, like the way Jake treated you today. It's insidious, and that's why it's so dangerous." His words resonated deeply with Olivia. She knew that what had happened wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger, more complex issue that extended far beyond the walls of Café Renaissance. "I just didn't expect it to happen here," she repeated, her voice softer this time, as if trying to make sense of it all. "We've always tried to create a space where people feel seen and respected, no matter who they are. And yet, even with all our efforts, this still happened." There was a pause as both of them reflected on the reality they were now facing. They had built something beautiful together, but they were reminded that no place was immune to the ugliness of prejudice. "We've always known this fight would be ongoing," Daniel said, breaking the silence. It doesn't end just because we set up rules or create an environment of inclusion. It's something we have to actively protect every single day. Olivia nodded, understanding the truth in his words. They couldn't take for granted that just because they had created a welcoming space, it would always remain that way. There would always be challenges, always be people like Jake who would test their resolve. But we can't let this change what we stand for, Olivia said firmly, finding strength in her own words. We built this place on the foundation of love and equality. That's what we have to focus on. Daniel smiled gently, proud of her resilience. Exactly, he said. This situation doesn't define us, but how we respond to it does. He paused for a moment, choosing his next words carefully. We need to take this as a reminder, not just for ourselves, but for our staff and our customers. This is a fight we all have to be part of. Olivia squeezed his hand, appreciating his perspective. She had always known that Daniel had a way of seeing challenges as opportunities to grow, and in this moment, she realized that this experience, as painful as it had been, was also a chance to reaffirm their values. I think we need to have a conversation with the staff, Olivia said, her mind already moving toward action. We need to make sure everyone understands that what happened today can't happen again. We have to be clear about what we stand for. Daniel nodded in agreement. You're right. We can't assume that everyone is on the same page. It's our responsibility to make sure they are. His voice carried a quiet determination, the kind that always surfaced when he was ready to tackle a problem head-on. They both knew that today's events were a wake-up call, a reminder that they had to remain vigilant in their commitment to creating a truly inclusive environment. As they sat there, reflecting on the day, the weight of what had happened began to lift slightly. It wasn't that the pain was gone, but they had found a way forward. Olivia knew that this wasn't the last time they would face challenges like this, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. We're going to get through this, she said, more to herself than to Daniel. And we're going to make this place even stronger because of it. Daniel smiled, his eyes filled with admiration. I have no doubt, he replied. Together, they had faced many obstacles, and this would be no different. Their bond, both in business and in life, was built on shared values that would guide them through even the toughest times. As they prepared to leave the restaurant for the day, Olivia took one last look around. The elegant space that she had helped design, the warm atmosphere that she and Daniel had cultivated, it all meant so much to her. And now, after today, it meant even more. Café Renaissance was more than just a restaurant. It was a symbol of hope, perseverance, and love. And no matter what challenges came their way, she and Daniel were determined to protect that legacy. After witnessing this shocking moment of discrimination, it's clear that the battle against racism isn't over. It's happening all around us, sometimes in places we least expect. Olivia's experience is a wake-up call, reminding us that even when we think we've created safe spaces, prejudice can still seep in. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to stand by and watch, or will you take action, speak up, and make a difference? This story isn't just about one woman's fight for respect, it's about all of us. What would you do if you were in Olivia's shoes? Would you have the courage to confront the problem, even when it feels uncomfortable? The truth is, we all have a part to play in creating the world we want to live in, one where respect, compassion, and equality aren't just words, but actions we take every day. Now is the time to reflect. Are you willing to fight for what's right, to stand up for yourself and for others, even when it's hard? If this story moved you, if it made you think, then it's time to take the next step. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we dive deeper into these tough conversations. Let's keep learning, keep growing, and most importantly, keep fighting for the world we want to see.